Don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts or story in the comments and subscribe to our latest stories. Before I start, tell me where you are watching me from. I wonder which cities and towns will join me in this memory that will follow me for years. He said it was just a favor. Simple, quick, nothing to think twice about. But I should have known better. Nothing that stirs the heart ever turns out to be as simple as it seems. The day it all began was an ordinary one. My kitchen smelled faintly of coffee and lemon soap, the kind of smell that lingers when you've scrubbed the counters a little harder than usual. The radio hummed in the background with old songs that reminded me of my younger years. I had just sat down with a book when my phone buzzed, breaking the stillness. It was Daniel. Daniel had been a friend of my late husband's, someone who'd stayed in touch out of kindness more than obligation. He was the sort of man who always offered help before you asked for it, though I rarely took him up on it. A widower himself, he carried an air of quiet patience, as though he knew how to wait for life to unfold. "Could you do me a favor?" he asked, his voice calm but touched with hesitation. "It won't take long. Just something I can't do on my own." I almost said no. Not because I didn't want to help, but because favors had a way of tugging me out of the safe little bubble I had built for myself. Since my husband's passing, I had grown used to routines, morning walks, reading on the porch, keeping the house neat as if it could fill the silence. Yet something in Daniel's voice, steady, but with an undertone of need, made me pause. "All right," I said finally. "What do you need?" He chuckled softly, as though relieved. "Not over the phone. Could I stop by later?" By evening, I found myself tidying up, even though I told myself it didn't matter. I brushed my hair, straightened the cushions, lit a small lamp that gave the living room a warm, golden glow. When he arrived, the air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves. His coat was speckled with the faintest trace of rain. "Come in," I said, stepping aside. His presence filled the room in a way I hadn't expected, calm, unhurried, but undeniably there. We sat across from each other, a steaming pot of tea between us. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he took a slow sip, his eyes resting on the framed photos on my mantel. Pictures of my family, my husband, my children grown and scattered across states. "I need help sorting through Margaret's things," he said at last. "It's been years, but I can't seem to do it alone. Every time I try, it feels like I'm erasing her." The words settled between us like a heavy blanket. Margaret, his wife. I remembered her well. Soft-spoken, with a laugh that carried warmth across a room. She had passed before my husband, and in some quiet way, that had connected Daniel and me. Loss recognizes loss. I nodded slowly. "I understand. I thought, maybe you'd know how to do it. You've faced this too." His eyes searched mine, not desperate, but honest. There was something humbling in a man of his age asking for help so directly. I agreed, though my heart tightened at the thought of walking into his house, touching the echoes of a life once whole. That night, after he left, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the sound of the wind against the windows, my mind replaying his words. It wasn't just a favor. It was an opening. A request to step into grief with someone else, to share the burden we both carried but rarely spoke about. The next morning, I drove to his home, a modest white house with blue shutters, the kind that looked like it belonged in a photograph of simpler times. His garden was overgrown, though a few roses still clung stubbornly to life. He met me at the door with a faint smile, holding it together the way men often do, firm on the outside, uncertain underneath. Inside, the house felt untouched by time. A knitted throw rested over the arm of a chair, a row of books sat neatly on a shelf, and on the dresser in the hallway, a vase held dried flowers, their colors faded but still graceful. We started in the bedroom. He opened the closet door, and there they were, Margaret's dresses, hung neatly as if waiting for her to return. The sight of them nearly broke me. The fabric seemed to hold her shape, her presence. Daniel stood silently, his hand brushing the sleeve of a blue dress. "I can't," he whispered as though I stepped forward. I folded the first dress carefully, smoothing it with my hands as though respecting the woman who once wore it. One by one, we went through the closet together. At first, he barely moved, watching, but soon he began to hand me items, his fingers lingering just a little before letting go. We talked in low voices, not about the clothes, but about her, about the day she wore the green dress to a wedding, about her love for baking bread on Sundays, about her laughter echoing in this very room hours past, but time felt suspended. I realized then that this wasn't a simple task of cleaning. It was a ritual, a way of honoring love that had ended in body but not in memory. When we finally sat down, surrounded by neatly folded piles, the late afternoon sun streamed through the curtains, casting long golden beams across the floor. Daniel leaned back, his face weary but softened. "Thank you," he said, his voice roughened with emotion he tried not to show. That I met his eyes and saw in them not just gratitude, but recognition. Recognition of the loneliness we both carried, and the quiet courage it took to face it together. As I left that evening, I looked back at his house, at the warm light in the window. I knew this was only the beginning of something neither of us had expected. He said it was just a favor, but it wasn't simple. It was the start of a journey that would change the way I looked at love, loss, and companionship forever. I didn't expect to go back the very next week, but life has a way of nudging us where we least plan to go. Daniel called again, not in the hurried tone of someone asking for help, but with a quiet hesitation. "I've been trying to sort the boxes in the attic," he said. "It's more than I thought. Would you come by again?" There was a pause on my end, the kind that carries more than silence. I could hear my own heartbeat, feel the weight of my answer. I had just begun to feel a strange lightness after that first day, as though a burden had been gently lifted from both of us. "Still," I agreed. Something inside me said this wasn't just about boxes. The morning I drove over, the sky was pale gray, with a thin mist clinging to the fields along the road. When I reached his house, Daniel was waiting at the door, sleeves rolled up, hair a little messy, as if he'd already been wrestling with the past. "This way," he said, leading me up the narrow staircase to the attic. The wooden steps creaked under our weight, the air grew warmer as we climbed, and when he opened the door, dust floated in beams of light from the small round window. The attic was crowded with boxes, neatly labeled but untouched for years. A rocking chair sat in the corner, draped with a quilt, and beside it, a stack of old photo albums. I bent down, opening one of the boxes. Inside were letters tied with ribbons, holiday cards, small tokens of a life shared. Daniel stood near me, hands in his pockets, watching. His face held that same expression as before, torn between holding on and letting go. "You don't have to go through all of this today," I said gently. He shook his head. "If I don't start, I never will. But I don't want to do it alone." So we began. He opened one box, I opened another. At first, the silence felt heavy, broken only by the rustle of paper and the scrape of cardboard. Then, slowly, the memories started to spill out. He picked up a small ceramic bird and smiled faintly. "She bought this at a flea market. Said it was ugly, but she couldn't leave it behind. I thought she was crazy. Now, I can't imagine this attic without it." I laughed softly, not at him, but with him. "That sounds like something I would do." We continued, and with each item, a story came. Photographs from trips, the old record player they'd bought together, letters filled with everyday words that now felt priceless. The attic transformed before my eyes, not just a storage space, but a gallery of love, mistakes, laughter, and time. As the hours passed, I noticed the way Daniel's voice grew steadier. At first, it trembled when he spoke her name, but by the afternoon, it carried warmth. He wasn't just grieving anymore, he was remembering. At one point, I found myself sitting on the old rocking chair, a photo album on my lap. The pictures showed a younger Daniel, standing tall beside Margaret, his eyes bright with the kind of hope only the beginning of love can hold. Daniel came and stood beside me, looking over my shoulder. "She made me promise we'd dance every anniversary," he said quietly. "Even when the kids were grown, even when she was sick. We danced here, in this house. Sometimes just in the kitchen." The weight of his words pressed into the silence between us. I closed the album carefully, set it aside, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The closeness wasn't about romance, it was about shared understanding. It was about standing at the edge of loss and finding someone willing to stand there with you. We worked until the light from the small window began to fade. By then, a few boxes were empty, others repacked neatly. But more than that, there was a change in the air. It felt lighter, as though the attic itself had exhaled. Before I left, Daniel walked me to the porch. The mist from the morning had lifted, and the evening sky burned with soft pink and gold. He leaned against the railing, quiet for a while, Then turned to me. "I don't know what I would have done without you today," he said. His voice carried more than gratitude, it carried trust. I smiled, though part of me felt unsteady. I hadn't expected this to matter so much. Not to him, and not to me. Yet as I drove home under the fading light, I knew I would come back again. He said it was just a favor, but I was beginning to see that it wasn't. It was a door opening, one that neither of us had expected to walk through, but both of us somehow needed. I wonder which cities and towns will join me in this memory that will follow me for years. By the time I returned the third time, I no longer told myself it was only about helping Daniel. Something had shifted, quietly, gently, like the way seasons turn without your noticing until the air feels different. He had called me on a Thursday afternoon. "I thought maybe you'd like to come by on Saturday," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Not to work this time. Just for supper. I'd like to cook for someone again." I hesitated before answering, though not because I didn't want to. The truth was, it had been years since anyone invited me to dinner in that kind of way, not out of obligation or family duty, but out of choice. "I'd like that," I finally said. Saturday evening, I stood at his door, my hands carrying a small basket of fresh bread from the bakery. He opened the door, and I noticed he had trimmed his beard, combed his hair, and wore a clean shirt, pressed just enough to show he had put in effort. The house smelled faintly of rosemary and garlic. "Come in," he said, smiling in a way that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. The table was set simply but carefully, 2 plates, candles that flickered against the glass window, and a casserole dish steaming in the middle. It wasn't elaborate, but it didn't need to be. The thought was enough. We ate slowly, the way people do when conversation matters more than finishing the meal. He asked me about my children, about their lives scattered across the states. I asked him about his garden, about the books he had been reading. The topics were ordinary, but the listening was extraordinary. He leaned in, not just to hear, but to understand. I found myself doing the same. After the meal, we moved to the living room. A fire burned low in the fireplace, and I could hear the faint hum of crickets through the open window. On the mantel sat a small radio, one of those old ones with a dial you had to turn carefully. He twisted the knob, and soft music filled the room. "A slow, gentle tune, something from years past, you know," he said after a moment. "Margaret and I used to dance to this song. Right here in this room." I smiled, not out of sadness but out of the sweetness of the memory. "I can almost picture it." He looked at me then, his expression caught somewhere between longing and gratitude. He didn't move closer right away. He let the silence linger, let the song fill the space. Then, almost carefully, he extended his hand. "Would you?" he asked. For a moment, I froze. It had been so long since I had held anyone's hand like that, not out of necessity but out of invitation. Slowly, I placed my hand in his. His palm was warm, steady. We danced. Not with the grace of youth, not with practiced steps, but with the quiet comfort of 2 people who knew life had been both kind and cruel, and who had decided to keep moving anyway. The floor creaked beneath us, the firelight flickered, and the old tune carried us. I thought of my husband then, not with sorrow, but with a strange peace. I thought of how life gives us many beginnings and endings, and how sometimes, against all odds, a new beginning slips into your life when you least expect it. When the music ended, neither of us let go right away. We stood still, hands clasped, eyes lowered, as though afraid to break whatever had formed between us. Finally, Daniel spoke. "I didn't ask you here tonight for another favor," he said, his voice low but clear. "I asked you because I wanted to remember what it felt like to share a moment with someone. And I think you've given me more than I ever expected." I swallowed hard, emotions tightening my chest. "You've given me something too," I said softly. That night, as I walked out to my car, the stars stretched endlessly above. The air was cool, scented with pine and earth, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a spark of possibility. He had said it was just supper, just a favor of company, but it wasn't simple. It was something unfolding, something fragile yet undeniable. As I drove home, I realized that the story of grief wasn't only about endings. Sometimes, it was also about rediscovering the courage to begin again. The 4th time I went to Daniel's house, it no longer felt like I was visiting a friend in need. It felt like I was stepping into a chapter of my own life I hadn't expected to write. The weight of grief had shaped us both, But in the quiet hours we had spent together, something else had begun to take form. It wasn't rushed, and it wasn't loud. It was steady, patient, like the way spring sunlight returns after a long winter. He greeted me at the door with that same crinkle-eyed smile I had grown used to. "I was hoping you'd come," he said, as if he hadn't doubted it. His confidence wasn't in my answer, but in the connection we were building that afternoon. We didn't work through closets or climb into attics. Instead, we sat on his porch, watching the slow sway of the trees in the wind. The fields stretched wide beyond his yard, gold and green, the kind of view that made you stop and breathe a little deeper. He poured us each a glass of iced tea, the lemon slices floating like small suns, and for a long while, we didn't say much. Finally, he broke the silence. "Do you ever feel like you've been carrying something so heavy for so long, that when it's gone, you don't know who you are without it?" I turned the glass in my hands, watching the light catch on the ice. Every day since my husband passed, grief became part of me. It shaped how I walked, how I spoke, even how I breathed. Letting go felt like losing him all over again. Daniel nodded slowly. "That's what I was afraid of too. But when you've been here with me, it doesn't feel like letting go. It feels like remembering, but without the weight pressing me down." His words struck something deep inside me. I looked at him then, not as my husband's old friend, not as a man struggling through his own grief, but as someone standing beside me on the same fragile road. We weren't replacing anyone we had lost. We were simply finding a way to live with the memories and still allow new ones to bloom. As the evening cooled, he brought out an old wooden box. Its corners were worn smooth, the hinges slightly loose. He set it between us, almost reverently. "This was Margaret's," he said. "She kept letters here, some from me, some from her family, some just little notes she wrote to herself. I've never been able to open it." He placed his hand on the lid, then looked at me. "Would you open it with me?" I hesitated, not out of fear, but out of respect. It felt like stepping into sacred ground. Still, I nodded, and together we lifted the lid. Inside were envelopes, yellowed with time, tied together in neat bundles. I picked one at random, and he read it aloud. It wasn't anything dramatic, just Margaret reminding herself to buy sugar, or telling him to pick up his coat from the tailor. But as he read, his voice softened, warmed, and I realized that love isn't always written in grand declarations. Sometimes, it lives in the smallest notes, the daily reminders, the gentle insistence on caring. When he finished, he set the letter down and looked at me with quiet honesty. "I thought opening this would break me. But it doesn't. Not with you here." My throat tightened. Maybe it's because some things aren't meant to be faced alone. The sun began to set, painting the sky in streaks of orange and violet. Daniel closed the box, his hand lingering on the wood, then reached for mine. It wasn't sudden, and it wasn't uncertain. It was the kind of gesture that felt natural, like we had been walking toward it all along. We sat like that for a long while, our hands resting together, the silence between us no longer heavy but full of meaning. I thought of all the times I had avoided change, how I had buried myself in routine to keep from feeling. And yet here I was, feeling more alive than I had in years. As I drove home later, the headlights cutting through the dark country roads, I reflected on how it all began. He had said it was just a favor, helping him sort through the pieces of a life once whole. But it had never been that simple. It had been about trust, about courage, about two people discovering that even in the shadow of loss, there is space for new light. And as much as grief had shaped us, it no longer defined us. What defined us now was the choice to keep moving, to keep remembering, and to keep opening our hearts to whatever came next. That was the real favor we gave each other, the chance to begin again.